What do you think would happen if Kamala Harris got elected president?
All the things that we see happening, you can put those on steroids. Of course, a lot of it will be driven by the media, who will try to make her seem like, she's the second coming of Christ.
You do know Donald Trump very well.
I know him very well.
When did you meet and when did you decide you liked him?
The first time we met was at Mar-a-Lago.
But then you ran against each other in the Republican primaries.
During the campaign, we talked, and I told him that God chose him, that he was going to win. There were a whole bunch of us running. I said, you're going to win because God is going to use you to help save our country. And he did.
What do you think of Kamala Harris?
I think she is a politician.
Yeah.
And she's interested in the accumulation of power and control.
Do you think she believes in anything?
I think she believes in government, like most Marxists.
Yes.
I think she is a Marxist.
Do you think that she can win?
Absolutely. She can win. This is going to be a great test of the power of the media to take someone who formerly was universally disliked and transform them into a godlike figure. And they will use everything that they have to try to do that. The question is, are the American people smart enough to see through it? And I actually think the American people are smarter than anybody gives them credit for. And I don't think that they are going to be willing to sacrifice what we have in this country, which is what everybody else wants, even though they try to denigrate our country, say we're systemically racist, we're unfair to people. If we were all that bad, why are all these people trying to get in here? And why aren't people trying to get out of here? So we know that we have something that's very good. And I think the American people realize that, and they're not willing to give that up and trade that for something inferior.
Were you surprised? It's interesting that you said the media are the key for Kamala Harris. Were you surprised how quickly the media pivoted from basically forcing Joe Biden out of his job to adoring and worshiping Kamala Harris?
No, that didn't surprise me at all, because I've been watching the media for a number of years, and I see how they're like a flock of birds. Have you ever noticed a large flock of birds, and they all turn at the same time, and they all go, and you say, how in the world are they doing that? They almost have this cohesive communication, and they work together. I accused one of the media of that about a week ago, and they said, how can you say that about us? Then I started talking about how they use the same language within minutes of the time that something comes up. Is it just a coincidence that they use the same language and the same phrases? They had to admit that there probably was some degree of cooperative work going on there.
Do you think that there's coordination, or it's a conspiracy of shared instinct? They all have the same worldview.
Both. I think both of those things are going on. But there's no question that they have lost their original intent. The media, the press, is the only business that's protected by the Constitution. And there was a reason for that. It's because they were supposed to disseminate unbiased information to the people so that the people could determine what their will was, because the country was supposed to be run on the will of the people. Now, the Europeans thought we were crazy. They said, you can't have a nation that's run on the will of the people. You have to have a monarch. You have to have a ruling body. But we have demonstrated for a very long time that we can run on the will of the people, but that is being distorted significantly because the press has, instead of deciding to disseminate unbiased information, they have decided to put their thumb on the scale and to push a certain agenda, which when you think about it, makes little sense because the agenda that they're pushing is more of a socialist, Marxist agenda. Well, what do socialists and Marxists do when they get in power? They control the media. It's almost the first thing that they do.
Yes.
So they're digging their own grave.
How responsible do you think media coverage is for Trump getting shot?
There's no question that they poisoned the atmosphere by saying, he's like Hitler and he's going to destroy democracy and is sort of Satan incarnate. When you have people who perhaps are not fully capable of controlling themselves, they can easily be influenced by that kind of activity. And it's just wrong. Now, I would quickly hasten that it's done on all sides in the political arena. Spending time demonizing other people because somehow they think that helps, and it does help for some people. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could actually discuss the issues?
Yes.
What are the policies that actually impact people's lives? If we could spend nearly as much time on that as we do talking about each other and denigrating each other, I think we could make some real progress. And I think we might actually find that there's more agreement than you think there is. I'd say 80% of issues your most radical left-wing and right-wing people would probably agree on. But we take that 10 to 20% and we magnify it and we make it the biggest issue to the point that people hate each other.
What do you think would happen if Kamala Harris got elected president?
I think we would continue to move in a very leftist direction. I mean, she was the most radical left-wing member of the Senate. She was even to the left of Bernie Sanders. She was a co-sponsor of the Green New Energy deal. She wants Medicaid for everybody, mandatory, no private insurance. As the DA, she was the one who basically didn't want to punish people who were guilty of horrendous crimes and repeat offenders. And she wanted open borders. And all the things that we see happening, you can put those on steroids if she becomes the president. And I hope people will go back and look at her record. Don't just listen to pleasant words that will be interspersed with ridiculous laughter, but go back and actually look at what she did and what she has said. And I think people will remember why she got no traction at all when she was running for president.
I'm really struck by that. I'm struck by how little popular support she's ever had, ever. So now, according to some polls, she's the sitting vice president, but she's the front runner in this race. How did that happen in a country that's supposed to be run by its people? That's a representative democracy.
Well, I mean, you talk about a threat to democracy when the votes of 14 million people are just tossed into the wastebasket and a bunch of backroom politicians make decisions.
You're talking about the primary votes.
Right. Then we end up with somebody who, on their own merits, would never have been in that position. That's a real problem. And there are consequences for doing things like that. The reason that our country accelerated from a bunch of ragtag militiamen to the pinnacle of the world is because we had a process, and it worked well, and it reflected the will of the people. When you throw that out, you can't anticipate that things will continue to go smoothly. They won't. And, we've just thrown a big kink in the whole thing. And hopefully the American people will correct it. I think our founders were very, very smart people. And they studied every single governmental system that had ever existed in the history of the world. And they were eclectics. They extracted the good things and they excluded the bad things. But one of the things that they noticed when they studied all of these governments is that all governments move in the same direction. Regardless of how they start, regardless of how lofty their ideals are, they grow, they infiltrate, and they dominate. And they wanted to give us a government that wouldn't do that, that would leave the people free and in charge. And that's why they work so hard. And as you know, it was very raucous, and there were a lot of different opinions about how to do that. And in the last convention in Philadelphia, Constitutional Convention, the whole thing was about to dissolve. Everybody go their separate ways. And elder statesman Benjamin Franklin, 81 years old, said, "Stop. Gentlemen, let's get down on our knees and let's ask God for wisdom." And they prayed and they got up and they resolved their differences and gave us the Constitution, which I believe is a God-inspired document. But if we neglect it, if we don't adhere to it, then we will suffer the consequences. And that's what the battle is right now. The battle that's going on in this election, it's not about Democrats and Republicans. It's about people who want a country that is of, for, and by the people, and people who want a government that is of, for, and by the government. That's what this is about.
So if you were in charge of Donald Trump's campaign, is that what you'd run on?
I would run on that, and I would run on policies. I would not run on personalities. That's a distraction.
It's very tempting with Kamala Harris.
It is tempting, but, much more tempting to me is trying to make sure that we show the contrast between those two systems, because they are very different. One of them will create a situation where the workers control their own lives, control their own budgets. And one of them is a situation where you turn everything over to the government, including your hard-earned wages.
Yes.
And they decide what to do with them.
Do you know Kamala Harris?
No, I've never met her.
You do know Donald Trump very well.
I know him very well.
When did you meet, and when did you decide you liked him?
The first time we met was at Mar-a-Lago. And this was maybe about 10 years ago. It was before either of us got into the political arena. And we were just enjoying each other's company. And someone says, "Rod Stewart just came in." He said, "I don't care. This is Ben Carson." I knew what kind of person he was at that point. And, my whole family was with me, my mother. And, it was a Easter program. And he just made sure that we were comfortable and that we were taking care of him, especially wanted to make sure my mother was comfortable. And there were all kinds of celebrities and important people walking around, and he was just trying to make sure that we were comfortable. And that's the kind of person he is. I noticed, the workers, the people who serve the meals, the people who park the cars. He knows those people. Yeah, he knows their names. He knows their families. The same thing at Trump Towers when I went there. And he seems to be a genuinely caring person. It didn't take long before, he knew my family, knew their names. He's just that kind of person, as opposed to the very superficial politicians who are always playing to the cameras and couldn't care less about you once you got out of the camera range.
You've seen that too?
Oh, I've seen that many times. Absolutely.
But then you ran against each other in the Republican primaries, and it didn't seem to wreck your relationship.
No, well, we discovered pretty early on in the process that we were very compatible. And, I was not a person who really particularly wanted to be president. I ran because there was so much insistence that I run after I gave the presidential keynote for the presidential prayer breakfast. And I had over 500,000 petitions in my office. There were people every place I went with signs, run, Ben, run. And, I really didn't want to do it, but there was just so much pressure. I just said to the Lord, if you really want me to do this, you got to give me all the stuff a person who runs for president has, a Rolodex with all the important names, a lot of money, an organization. And I said, I don't have any of those things, nor do I intend to develop them. The next thing I knew, they were all there. And our organization was raising more money in a month than the RNC. It was incredible. But during the campaign, we talked, and I told him that God chose him, that he was going to win. There were a whole bunch of us running. I said, you're going to win because God is going to use you to help save our country. And he did.
How'd you foresee that?
Because I knew the kind of policies that he espoused, and that those were the things that were needed to turn our country around. They were the same things that I was thinking about. The difference was he wanted to do it, and I didn't. So that's why I endorsed him so quickly when I dropped out. And
what did he say when you told him you believed God had chosen him to save the country? What was his response?
I don't remember his specific words, but he was kind of taken aback that I would say that. And he reminds me of that very frequently. And I think he's really thinking about it since the assassination attempt, recognizing that he's there for a specific reason. And, I had a hard time when I dropped out convincing my followers to go with him. I got a lot of calls, particularly from evangelical leaders, and I just said, no, don't be swayed by all the noise. Look at the policies that this man is putting forth, because we have to save our country, and think about all the people who preceded us and the sacrifices they made. We can't throw it all away. And we've got to be able to overlook some of the things that the media is going to try to focus you on. Those aren't the important things when it comes to a leader. And I explained to them that, this was a man who made his way in the real estate market in Manhattan, one of the toughest real estate markets anywhere in the world. I said, you're not going to be successful in that market unless you're very tough. And that means you may have some rough edges. And we just have to recognize that and be able to move beyond that and see that this is a man whose policies, do you agree with those policies or do you not? And several of the leaders then came and started thinking in a different way. And we had a big evangelical rally. At first it was going to be like 50 pastors. It ended up being 2,000. And at that time, I think he realized that, boy, this is an incredible block of people that we need to be working with.
So much poison now in our public square, and if you take almost all of it and trace it to its roots, you'll arrive at the same place, the higher education system in the United States. This is coming out of our colleges and universities, and it's not an accident. Radical professors and administrators have transformed higher education into this country into an indoctrination factories, specializing in teaching anti-American, anti-human ideologies. That's not an overstatement. So instead of encouraging civil debate in the pursuit of truth, which was the point, universities teach students that they should become social activists, deranged social activists, and that's the highest level of achievement. So instead of shaping American citizens who defend their rights and are proud of their heritage to keep the country going and our civilization intact, universities instead celebrate global citizenship and promote contempt for the achievements of the West, hatred of our own civilization. Instead of teaching students to behold nature and its undeniable God-created beauty, they push anti-science nonsense like transgenderism and climate panic and the worship of public health bureaucrats, dumbest of all. Most importantly, instead of providing an education that seeks transcendent truth from God, universities teach students to reject the concept of the divine and think only about themselves, institutionalized narcissism. The results of this, of course, is sad. American universities, once the envy of the world, have become hostile, mediocre places. But there's at least one college that stands apart and has for 180 years. Hillsdale College has stayed true to its original mission, even in the midst of all this chaos. Hillsdale was founded in 1844 by patriotic abolitionist Christians. They were providing information and education necessary to, quote, preserve civil and religious liberty and intelligent piety in America. And they've done that from the beginning. Hillsdale has always refused to discriminate based on race, religion, or sex. And in effect, that means no racist quota systems, no DEI officers, no Marxist struggle sessions posing as education in the classroom. No, Hillsdale has stayed true and kept faith with the old idea that the purpose of a college is the shared pursuit of knowledge. To remain independent in doing all this, and it hasn't been easy, Hillsdale is one of the only colleges in the United States that refuses all government funding. Federal, state, local, none. And unlike so many universities that rely on a government subsidy and view most Americans with contempt, Hillsdale is committed completely to sharing the best things from its classrooms to every person in the United States, every American who wants to learn for free. And as part of that commitment, Hillsdale offers free online courses based on its core curriculum that every student there takes on campus. That would include American history, politics, the Bible, classic literature, Western philosophy, music, foreign policy. It keeps going. And they're great. More than 4 million people have taken free online courses with Hillsdale, no charge whatsoever. Check it out. Go to tuckerforhillsdale.com to start learning about everything that Hillsdale offers. Again, even if you're opposed to college, even if you're one of the many Americans like me who thinks, if I had to do it again, I would never send kids to college, Hillsdale is different. Check them out. And while you're there, you can sign up for their free course on the American left right now. This course explains the origins and the fundamental ideas of the modern American left. We talk about it a lot on this show. The course explains where it came from. It explains how transgenderism, identity politics, global government, these are concepts that were formerly just at the fringes of academia. True, crazy people, tinfoil hat people, all of a sudden they're at the very mainstream, the core, the center of American public life. Why? This course will explain. It explains how neoliberalism arose in the 1970s and how that idea has changed the very core, the basis of America, the morality and the economy of the country we live in now. So fixing all of this, recovering the American way of life, is going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. But part of the work is learning that there is truth. And there's a history to all of this. It happened for a reason. They don't want you to know what the reason is. Hillsdale will tell you. Sign up for free. Start learning about Hillsdale and from Hillsdale. Go to tuckerforhillsdale.com. Highly recommended. So then you went to work in the administration.
Yes.
What was that like?
I had a very hard time in the beginning, obviously, because I didn't have a deputy secretary for 8 months, and I didn't have any assistant secretaries for 5 months because they were playing politics. Didn't want to give me the people, hoped that maybe I would go away. But of course, that just makes you more determined to stay.
Yes.
And once we got the right people in place. It was wonderful. We were very much aligned with the idea of getting rid of the regulations. When I was running for president, I talked about how that was the major cause of sluggish economy. We had so many regulations. We got rid of over 2,000 regulations at HUD, regulations and sub-regulations, which made it much easier to get things done. And of course, we had a situation, you always heard the stories about the malfeasance, the fiscal problems going on at HUD. You probably noticed a year and a half into the Trump administration, you never heard those stories anymore, because we were able, with much cajoling and arm twisting, to get one of the former senior partners at Ernst & Young to come on and really to take on the whole HUD organization, which was difficult. He said in the beginning, he looked at the books and he said, Ernst & Young would never have taken you guys as a client.
No.
But
fearing criminal exposure.
Exactly. But it was fixed and probably is now the best run agency in Washington, D.C. I hope they haven't destroyed it all by now. But it made it much easier to get things done. It was easy to work with President Trump because he realized what we were doing, understood, the business of real estate, of housing, and was a tremendous partner in getting it done.
Would you go back into a second Trump administration?
Let me put it this way. I am fully dedicated to helping to save our country. And, there are a variety of ways that can be done. And I will be following the guidance from the good Lord in terms of which is the best way to do that.
So Trump was getting more support from African Americans than any Republican since Nixon, I think. Maybe even more than Nixon. Does Kamala Harris change that?
There's no question that there will be some people who will vote for her just because of the demographics that she represents physically. But I'm not sure it's going to be as great as they think. When she was running for president, she didn't get a large amount of Black support. And I know the media is going to do everything to make her seem like Martin Luther King in a different body. But I think people maybe are not going to be as easy to manipulate as that. And I think Trump will continue to attract a lot of people in the Black community because his policies recognize that a rising tide lifts all boats. And, I don't think Black people are particularly interested in having an advantage over everybody else. They just want a level playing field, something that works for everybody. And I think that's one of the reasons that Trump is attracting so much attention.
Kamala Harris wouldn't be an obvious kind of leader of African Americans, and she's, grew up in Canada, had a Jamaican immigrant father, an Indian immigrant mother. It's not obvious why she would be the choice of African Americans, I guess.
No, it's the perceptions.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of it will be driven by the media who will try to make her seem like, she's the second coming of Christ. But I just don't think that that's going to work in this particular case. Not to mention the fact that in the past, at least, she has not been an inspirational individual. And, her speeches have certainly not been the kind that would have people fired up and saying, yes, we will go to the end of the earth for this woman.
Yeah.
So I hope she has some really good speechwriters.
Yeah, it's interesting if you can get Kamala Harris elected president. You've kind of proven that the democracy's fake, I think.
Well, Nancy Pelosi once said, I can take this glass of water and I can put a D behind it and get it elected. There's no question there is a machine and there is a mechanism for doing things. So you saw how effective it was in Pennsylvania for Fetterman at a time when, before he recovered from his stroke, he was a basket case.
He couldn't talk.
And yet he was still able to be elected over someone who was very articulate and very logical, Dr. Oz. So no one should underestimate the impact of that machine and what it can do.
I don't think we're allowed to talk about voter fraud on YouTube, which tells you that it's real. But are you concerned that letting in tens of millions of people illegally will have an effect on the outcome of this election?
Well, of course it will. I mean, that's the whole purpose of it. And I've talked to people who told me, they in Baltimore go into the voting station and just vote. They didn't have to show any ID. They didn't have to do anything. I remember one person who worked with me said, I went in there and they told me to vote. And she said, do you want to see my ID? And they said, no, we don't need to see your ID. So think about that and then multiply that by hundreds of thousands or millions of people. It can have a profound effect on the election. But also think about the fact that when people come in here illegally, they get legally counted in the census, which then is used to help determine how many representatives they have. So it has an impact that way also. So it definitely has an impact. It's just a matter of how great that impact will be. And as time goes on and you get more representatives who lean left, then you get legislation passed that becomes very friendly to people who've entered this country illegally. And you can profoundly change it to a point where it will never move in a different direction.
How far away from that are we now, do you think?
I think we're 1 or 2 elections away from that. And that's why it's so vitally important that we have people who can explain this in a way that people who are not legal or political scholars understand what's going on and are not so easily manipulated. We have to recognize that we're being manipulated. And this goes back a long way. There have always been people who have not been happy with the United States and with the way that we do things. And you can go all the way back to 1963 and look at the congressional record. January the 10th, 1963, Congressman Herlong of Florida read into the record the 45 goals of communism in America and how they plan to fundamentally change our society. It was derived from a book called The Naked Communist by W. Cleon Carlson, who was a CIA agent and had done a lot of study on communism and its effect. And you look at those 45 goals, it was things like gaining control of the public school system and the teacher unions so that you could indoctrinate the kids, gaining control of the news media and Hollywood so that you could manipulate the opinions of people, denigrating the role of the family, denigrating the role of the church, getting into the churches and changing the real gospel to the social gospel, making sexual perversion normal, natural, and healthy. I mean, just right down the line, all the things. And they're the things that are happening in our society right now. And we, the American people, are the pawns who are being manipulated. And it's one of the reasons that Khrushchev was so confident when he talked to Eisenhower and said that your grandchildren's children will live under our system. We won't have to fight a war because we think we won the Cold War. But they had a much better plan on how to actually change us, and we're falling for it. And we, the American people, have got to wake up before it's too late. And we've got to understand that part of the goal to overcome us is to divide us on the basis of race, age, income, gender, political affiliation, religion.
Yeah.
Because a house divided against itself cannot stand. Jesus said it. Abraham Lincoln reiterated it. And it's absolutely true. And you look and you see what's happening to our society. You know, we are neighbors and friends and co-workers and colleagues. We are not enemies. And look at the first letter of each of those words. We are not enemies. W-A-N-E, wane. We've allowed hatred and division to wax for a long time. Now it's time to let it wane and come together once again. It's okay to disagree about things. It doesn't make someone your enemy. Just because they have a different yard sign or a different opinion, it doesn't change the fact that that's your neighbor. And you think about the early days in our country when you had communities, sometimes of 50 or 100 families. They came from different areas of the world. In many cases, they could barely talk to each other because they spoke different languages. But they understood a concept called the common good. That's language that you see in much of the writings of our founders. The common good, what's good for all of us, not what's good for the Polish section or the German section or the African section, but what's good for everybody. And that was one of the things that made the difference. You know, if it was harvest time and Mr. Johnson broke his leg, everybody else harvested his crops. They didn't say, are you a Democrat or a Republican? What's your religion? No, they said, you're my neighbor and you need help. That was one of the real strengths of our nation. And we're allowing that to be destroyed. We're being manipulated. And one of the reasons I believe that that's happening is because we are the major obstacle to one world government and one world domination, but we cannot be overcome militarily. So you have to overcome us by destroying us from within.
One of the reasons that people talked about the common good and believed that it was important is because they were Christians, and therefore they believed in the moral equality of mankind because every person's created by God. That doesn't seem to be a common view in the way that it was even 20 years ago. And at the same time, the U.S. government seems openly hostile to Christianity, particularly the Biden-Harris administration, replacing Easter with Transvisibility Day, et cetera, putting people in prison for praying in abortion clinics, et cetera, et cetera. Do you notice this hostility toward?
Oh, without question. But recognize that that's part of the overall plan of Marxism. Marxism and communism is very anti-religion because they want you to be dependent on government. They don't want you to be dependent on God. And they want you to believe that they have the ultimate say in everything. So naturally, they're going to be anti-religion and anti-God. And it's sad to see, I mean, when you look at television, the way that they mock Christians and Christianity. And you saw all of the protests that occurred recently when the governor of Louisiana said we're going to have the 10 Commandments in the schools. And the governor of Oklahoma and the legislature said we're going to teach Bible and the 10 Commandments. Oh, no, you can't do that. This is horrible. Separation of church and state. You know, the Constitution says nothing about separation of church and state, by the way. That's been distorted tremendously. But I like to ask these people, exactly why don't you want the 10 Commandments to be taught? What is wrong with thou shalt not kill? What's wrong with thou shalt not steal? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not lie. Thou shalt not envy. Honor your parents. What's wrong with those things? And of course, they never have a good answer for what's wrong with them because there is nothing that's wrong with them. And, these are basic principles of civilization. And you can go to the deepest, darkest jungle of Borneo, and if you find a thief, what does he do? He waits until nighttime when nobody can see him, and he goes and steals. Why did he do that? Because he knows it's wrong. There is such a thing as right and wrong, and there's nothing wrong with us teaching that to our children.
I don't think they've gotten rid of religion in the public square. They've just changed the religion, and it's now transgenderism.
And environmentalism.
Right. But it's recognizable to me immediately as a theology.
No, it is. And their belief in it is very strong, and they go so far as to want to punish those who disagree with them and make life very difficult for them. I think we're in a situation now where our society, to a large degree, actually thinks logically and understands the difference between right and wrong and good and evil. But we have people who are afraid. They're afraid to express their ideals because of the punishment, because of cancellation, because somebody might call them a bad name, because somebody might make life difficult for their family. But what we have to recognize is when you stand up for what you believe in, you give license and encouragement for others to do the same thing. And remember, you cannot be the land of the free if you're not the home of the brave.
Well, here's a secret that can get 50% cut right off your phone bill every month, which for a lot of Americans is a big savings. Here's the secret. Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile want you to believe that you need something called unlimited data. Unlimited data! But the fact is that most people don't need unlimited data, and nobody should be forced to pay for it. It's really expensive. That's where Pure Talk comes in. Pure Talk only charges you for the data you want. How's that for an idea? So talk, text, and 5 gigs of data is just $25 per month. How much is 5 gigs of data? Well, you can browse the internet for 135 hours. You can stream 1,000 songs. You can watch 10 hours of video. So you're probably overpaying for what you use. You don't have to anymore. Switch to Pure Talk and America's most dependable 5G network for just $25 a month. And you can feel good about it because Pure Talk is proudly veteran-led and supports American jobs. Their whole customer service team is here in the United States of America, where you live. There's no offshoring. The average family saves almost $1,000 a year by switching to Pure Talk. There's no contract, no cancellation fees. There's a 30-day money-day-back guarantee. It makes switching wireless companies easy. So go to puretalk.com/Tucker and you save an additional 50% off your very first month. That's puretalk.com/Tucker to switch your cell phone service to a company you can be proud and happy to do business with. Was it strange for you to go, actually like Trump, you were very famous before you entered politics. Mm-hmm. And also like Trump, but to a greater extent really than Trump, you were loved by the media and by our institutions. Was it strange to go from being a hero to a villain basically overnight?
It wasn't strange. It was expected. I recognized that would likely occur. But then I had to ask myself, what are you here for? And why has God used you in this way? And why has he given you such amazing accomplishments and a platform? And obviously, it was not to look for the approval and adulation of mankind. It was to fulfill your duty to God and bring praise and honor and glory to his name. So it never really bothered me, particularly when a lot of the mainstream said he's a horrible person. And,
He's a horrible person.
Never mind the fact that he saved thousands of lives and came up with all kinds of new ways to do wonderful things. He's a horrible person because whatever they believe is not what he believes. And the good thing is that I don't encounter a lot of people who feel that way. When I go to the airport, when I came in here yesterday and I went to the airport, I had a line of people waiting to take pictures with me and to shake my hand and to thank me. And that's what I find, just about every place I go. So the mainstream media, they do their best to demonize anybody who doesn't agree with them. But I don't think they're as effective as they think they are.
I think that's exactly right. How have you been so successful? How have you been able to be so successful in your personal life?
Again, it goes back to my relationship with God. And, my wife and I, we start every day reading from the Bible and praying. And we end every day reading from the Bible and praying. And, God is an essential part of our lives. And we taught that to our children.
How long have you done that with your wife?
Since we've been married, which is 49 years.
Where did you meet her?
We met at Yale back in the days before it was quite as radical as it is today. Mm. We were both from Detroit, and we didn't know each other in Detroit, but we went to Yale, and people who knew both of us were always saying, you two should get together. You two would just be magic caught together. And finally, we did get together. It was interesting because the university was trying to get some more diversity. And so they would pay your way home for Thanksgiving if you would recruit for them in the Detroit public school system. And so the two of us agreed to go back and recruit. During that recruiting period, we discovered we kind of liked each other. We're actually driving back to New Haven from Ann Arbor, and we were going to drive all night to get back in time the next day. And we both fell asleep on Interstate 80,
Ooh.
Going 90 miles an hour, awakened by the vibration of the car as it was going off the road. And I grabbed the wheel and turned, and the car just started spinning. Instead of flipping over and going down the ravine, it just started spinning. And it stopped, pointing in the right direction, just in time for me to pull off as an 18-wheeler came through. Well, of course, we were quite awake at that point. And we just knelt and prayed, and we thank God for saving our lives. And that's the night we started going together, and we said the Lord saved our lives for a reason.
Amazing.
Yeah. And that was
How old were you?
Was on the 28th of November, 1972, and we celebrate the 28th of each month. We call it our month-iversary.
Really? For over 50 years you've done that?
For over 50 years, yes.
Amazing. And you had 3 sons and you have 8 grandchildren.
Correct.
And you're close to all of them.
Absolutely.
How did you do that?
God, once again, was always at the center of what we did. And we would have family worship. My mother lived with us too while the kids were growing up, which was a tremendous blessing. And we would all choose 2 verses from the Bible, usually from the book of Proverbs, and read them and interpret them. And so the boys became very familiar with the Bible and its interpretation and talking about it. And we, of course, went to church every week and continued to make God a very important part of our lives. In fact, one of my boys is married to his wife is a minister.
Really?
Yes.
What was your mother like?
My mother was perhaps the wisest person I've ever met. She was from a huge rural family in Tennessee, dire poverty, shifted from home to home, never had a place to really call home. got less than a third grade education. In order to escape dire poverty, she got married at age 13. And she and my father moved to Detroit. He was a part-time minister and a factory worker. She subsequently, some years later, discovered he was also a bigamist, had another family. And of course, that resulted in a divorce, and she had raised us by herself.
How old were you when your parents split up?
I was 8 years old.
Oh.
And it was devastating to me. I just prayed every night that the Lord would help my parents to get back together, but it never happened. Later on, I realized why. Because, my father was into gambling and booze, drugs, women. Women are okay, but you only need one.
Yeah.
And
best to limit yourself to one.
That probably would not have been a good influence on me. So it actually turned out well. But my mother had to work very hard to keep a roof over our head. And she worked as a domestic, but she was also a spy. And she says, I clean these beautiful homes in these beautiful neighborhoods. I'm going to spy on them and see, well, how come they're so successful? And she concluded that they were so successful because they didn't watch a lot of TV and they read a lot of books.
That was her conclusion?
That was her conclusion. So she came home and imposed that on me and my brother, and we were not happy campers. And in today's world, we would have called social services, but we had to read the books. And she wanted me to read Up From Slavery.
Yep.
By Booker T. Washington.
Great book.
The whole ideal of self-sufficiency. And as I started reading books about people of great accomplishment, surgeons and explorers and inventors and entrepreneurs, and I began to realize that the person who had the most to do with you and your success was you. It wasn't somebody else. It wasn't some circumstance. I stopped listening to all the negative people who were saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, society is stacked against you. I just threw all that stuff in the garbage. And I got to the point where if I had 5 minutes, I was reading a book. And in the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class. And it had a profound effect on everything I did. But the other thing about my mother is, as difficult a life as she had, she never allowed herself to be a victim. And she never made excuses. And that was a good thing. The problem was she never accepted excuses from us either.
So if you became self-pitying or blamed someone else, what did she say?
The next thing out of her mouth was a poem called Yourself to Blame. You're the captain of your ship. And, it goes through several different verses. She knew the whole thing by heart. And we didn't want to hear that poem, so we stopped making excuses.
How did she get that way?
I don't know. She was rather unique. She was ahead of her time. And, she was illiterate. When she was making us read books and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that, she would put little marks and things on them and checks and act like she was reading them. We didn't know she couldn't read. But she did eventually teach herself to read, got her GED, went to college, and in 1994 got an honorary doctorate degree. And so she was Dr. Carson too.
Amazing. How long did she live with you and your wife?
For close to 20 years. It was wonderful having her influence on the boys as they grew up, because they got the same kind of treatment that my brother and I got.
Whatever happened to your father? Did you ever see him?
The last time I saw him was at my wedding when I got married. And I didn't have any hard feelings toward him. I was at that time understanding why he left the picture, and that it was probably a good thing rather than a bad thing. But of course, I am very pro-family, very pro-traditional family, nuclear family. That's why I wrote the book, The Perilous Fight, Overcoming Our Cultural War Against the American Family. Because if you look at the think tanks, the liberal think tanks and the conservative think tanks and all the study groups, they all agree that children raised in a traditional nuclear family do much better on all parameters than those who are not. And yet we find ourselves not really pushing the traditional nuclear family. You turn on a television series, within 5 minutes, you get introduced to a non-traditional family. And not only as acceptable, but as the preferred thing. And there is a real war on traditional families. There's a real war in terms of children and the formation of families. The average birth per woman now is down to 1.6. You need 2.1 just to maintain the population. And then we have people getting married very late, if at all. And that, of course, depresses the birth rate as well. So we have a real cultural issue that's going on that needs to be dealt with. We need to be encouraging marriage and family formation and birth of children, and not succumb to the other influences. One of the popular things now is DINKs, double income, no kids. And because you get to lavish all of it upon yourselves, you don't have to worry about anybody else. But what about when you're 80 or 85 years old and you don't have another generation who's concerned about you? People need to begin to think beyond their immediate gratification.
And also raise the question, like, is the point of life to go on vacation?
Exactly.
What is the point of life?
And, and I wonder about that for people who don't have a belief in God, a belief in the hereafter, a belief in the goodness of people. What is their point? And I guess their only point is, let me have as much fun as I can, because then I'll be gone and that'll be the end. I would be very depressed if that was the way I thought.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that fun.
No.
So if you were giving counsel to, I guess you've already done it with your own boys, all three are married and have children, but if you were giving advice to a 25-year-old young man, what would it be?
Well, I would say, what are you good at? Because first thing you need to do is, I hope you're working. And if you're not working, you need to find out what career you should be pursuing. Everybody's good at something. But so often people do things based on what other people's success is and not on what their gifts and talents are.
Yes.
And for instance, when I started medical school, I did very poorly on the first set of comprehensive exams. So poorly, in fact, that my counselor told me to drop out of medical school. He said, you're not cut out for medicine, and you're just going to torment yourself and everybody else, and we're going to help you get into another area. I was devastated. I'd only wanted to be a doctor since I was 8 years old. I finally get to medical school, and the person who's supposed to help me says, drop out. And, I immediately sought wisdom from God. And I started thinking, what kind of courses have you always done well in, and what kind of courses have you struggled in? And I realized I did well in courses where I did a lot of reading. I struggled in courses where I listened to a lot of boring lectures.
Yeah.
Because I didn't get anything out of boring lectures. I got zero. and that's 6 hours a day. So I made an executive decision to skip the boring lectures and to spend that time reading. And the rest of medical school was a snap after that. And years later, when I was back at my medical school as the commencement speaker, I was looking for that counselor because I was going to tell him he wasn't cut out to be a counselor. Because some people are just negative. And they can always figure out why you can't do something, but they can't figure out how you can do something. And we really need to be positive influences in our spheres of influence. And that's what I would tell that 25-year-old. First, find out what you're good at and find out how you learn how you learn, and throw yourself into a career. Because when you're young, that's when you're energetic. That's when you're likely to accomplish a lot. You look at Nobel Prize winners in physics and mathematics and things like that. They usually don't get the prize until they're in their 50s, 60s, or 70s. But it's for work they did when they were in their 20s and 30s.
I know. I've noticed that.
So, when you're young and vigorous, that's the time to really throw yourself into your work.
Social media are great. They're important. They're the main way we communicate with each other. They're where politics happen in this country. But one of the problems with social media is that the rules change. The people in charge don't want you to say something. They don't tell you that. And the next thing you know, you're without a platform. Well, now you have an option. Parler. It's back. The original free speech app, taken off the internet by the censors, has come back in full force. Parler was the first big app to be pulled off because it was the first big app to make free speech a top priority. Now, other platforms may be relaxing their policies and they change a lot, but Parler will not change. Its distinct approach is here to stay. By paving the way for other apps to protect users' free speech, Parler has set the standard in the industry. It is now launched on a hyperscaled private cloud called Parler Cloud, and that means your data are secure. Your words cannot be controlled by third-party companies. It's uncancelable. Again, Parler has been canceled. They don't plan to be canceled again, and they've taken extensive and very expensive steps to make sure it's not going to happen. Parler is not at the mercy of other companies that don't believe in free speech. And here's the best part, it's ad-free. You are not the product on Parler. Parler is committed to providing a space where you can share and engage without interference of ads or invasive targeting. So it's more than just a platform, it is effectively a movement, and its goal is to keep the free flow of information open globally, where everybody can talk without fear of suppression. So it's upholding the values this country was founded on: free expression, open dialogue, also innovation, by the way. We're on Parler, at Tucker Carlson, and you can go there and find us and stay informed about what's happening in the world. So join a place that embraces your right to say what you actually think and that fosters connections between people. Without free speech, you can't connect with other people. We're all just lying to each other. But Parler offers you that, a seamless social media experience tailored to your needs. You can get Parler from the App Store, Google Play, or visit parler.com. At Parler, you are valued, you can say what you think, and you're rewarded for doing so.
So maybe more impressive than having 3 successful sons, so that's pretty impressive, is being with the same woman happily for over 50 years, which you have pulled off. So what specific advice would you give to married men for keeping your marriage intact and happy?
I would say, remember what attracted you in the first place and work on that. But make sure you have fun together. Spend quality time together. I enjoy to relax playing pool.
Playing pool?
Playing pool. When we got married, my wife did not know how to play pool. But she became a very good pool player because she says, that's the way I can have quality time with you.
Do you play at home?
Yes, absolutely. We have pool tables everywhere.
Really? Why pool?
It just relaxes me.
Did you play as a kid?
I learned when I was a teenager how to play. And just the angles and figuring out which the kinetic energy, all that stuff has always been enjoyable to me.
Are you good?
Yes.
A surgeon's precision brought to the pool table.
Exactly. And just, doing things that you enjoy together.
So that means you were in pool halls in Detroit in the 60s.
No, we had a little table. It wasn't a slate bottom table, and it wasn't particularly straight. But it was something that you could learn the principles on.
Why do pool tables have slate in them? Pardon my ignorance.
Because if you have a wood foundation, it can warp.
Yes.
And you need that table to be very smooth and very level. So that's why they do it.
Oh. So you still play pool with your wife?
Absolutely.
Who wins?
I win most of the time, but if I make a mistake, she can clean a table.
Amazing.
It's very good.
By the way, were you in Detroit in the summer of 67 for the riots?
Yes. Yep. July the 23rd, 1967. I was there. Tanks rumbling down the streets. It was pretty awful. But, what's interesting about that situation is the city was absolutely torn apart. There was a lot of racial hatred, and it was like a war zone. Exactly 1 year later, the Detroit Tigers were doing extremely well. They went on to win the World Series for the first time in 37 years. The city was one. Everybody was brought together because they were so excited about the Tigers. And the moral of the story is, look at the things that bring you together.
Yes.
Emphasize those things, not the things that tear you apart.
What do you think happened? So the Detroit pre-67 Detroit was a functioning, affluent city.
Well, Detroit at one point was the most affluent city in the country.
Yeah.
They had everything going for them. But, a lot of corruption started, unfortunately, causing a real problem. Plus, Detroit was a one-horse town.
Yeah.
And that's never good. You need to really diversify. So a combination of those things led to a pretty big decline. And then criminal activity became a real problem. It went from the motor city to the murder city. And that was very problematic.
So when you came back on vacation from Yale, from college, did you notice the difference?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I remember how difficult it was to get a summer job because at that time there was another issue that was going on. Japan and the Japanese car industry, Toyota and Datsun and all of these things were having a huge impact on the automotive industry throughout the world. And it had a negative impact on Detroit. So that, along with the other issues that we just talked about, really took its toll on Detroit.
Did you go back?
Occasionally, but not very often. I don't have any family left there.
What's the neighborhood you grew up in like now?
Well, I grew up in two different neighborhoods. The first neighborhood, the one I was born into in Southwest Detroit, it was a lot of GI homes. And I thought they were pretty nice homes. To me, they were like paradise. They were small, like 700 square feet, but they had like a little yard. In many cases, there was a little garage. And people worked hard and they were proud of their homes. They tried to keep them up. after the divorce, we couldn't live there anymore. And in fact, we were homeless for a little while. And we ended up moving.
Where'd you live when you were homeless?
With different people. Stayed in their homes. But one of my mother's sisters in Boston and her husband took us in.
Huh.
It was a typical tenement, large multifamily dwelling, boarded up windows and doors, sirens and gangs, rats and roaches, murders. Both of my older cousins who we adored were killed. I mean, that was the kind of place that it was. But at least it was a roof over our heads for a couple of years until we were able to get back to Detroit, still in a multifamily setting with plenty of wildlife. But nevertheless, she was independent at that point. And the goal was always to get back to that first neighborhood. And, after a couple of years, my mother worked very hard and we were able to get back to that neighborhood.
Have you seen it in the last 20 years?
Yes. I actually went back to it with President Trump.
How is it?
It looks largely the same. Some of the neighbors were still there who were there when I was growing up. It was very nice to see them. But, it has the wear and tear, obviously, of a few decades, but people still try to take care of their property. And, it helps me to realize how blessed I've been. Just in terms of being able to navigate around the world, to own properties, to do all kinds of things that I never would have thought was possible. People say the American dream is dead. It's not dead by any stretch of the imagination. But it required a lot of work. Extremely dedicated, hard work for many, many years. People don't just give you stuff, nor should they. But as I tell people all the time, if you work hard and you make yourself valuable and people need you, guess what? They pay you and you do okay.
So you were in Detroit after the riots when Coleman Young first became mayor. And
Yes.
he was the first big city American mayor to be explicit about race politics.
Right.
And the idea was, we're going to get some for the people of Detroit, but it was explicitly racial. I don't think it worked. Detroit didn't get richer.
No, it didn't work at all. And what it did is it pushed a lot of the white people out of the city.
Yeah, almost all of them.
Yeah. And, the city didn't benefit from a lot of the things that more affluent people brought to it. And it deteriorated very rapidly at that point. And, interestingly enough, I think people have learned that people are people.
Yeah.
And Detroit's been making progress over the last few years.
Yes.
And the mayor there, Duggan, he's white, but he is a people person. I mean, he became mayor by walking from door to door, going into people's living rooms, talking to them, finding out what their needs were, developing relationships between people. He not only got elected, but he got reelected, and has been working with, several business entities and trying to bring real revival to Detroit.
You were raised in a world, it sounds like, by your mother where merit was the measure.
Absolutely. She pushed excellence. And, to a large degree, both my brother and I worked really hard in school because we wanted to please her, because we knew what she was doing for us. We understood that, she could have taken up the offers of some people. Many of them were well-to-do individuals and kind of forgotten about us, but she didn't.
You mean gotten remarried?
Mm-hmm.
And she never did?
She never did. And she was always thrilled with what we were doing. After working 2 or 3 jobs a day, if I had a concert, she would come to the concert.
What'd your brother wind up doing?
He became the rocket scientist. I became the brain surgeon, and he became the rocket scientist. And
did anyone else in your neighborhood do that well? The kids you grew up with?
Well, I mean, there was some people, a few people who, not well known or anything like that, but I think 2 of my classmates at Southwestern High School became physicians.
Wow.
And at least one became a lawyer. And so, there were sporadic people. But, at that time, there was much more of a push for people to do better than their parents. And now you don't see it as much. You see more people saying that system is against you and you're a victim and we got to march for your rights, and, you need to do what you need to do in order to get your own. And if that's taking stuff from somebody else, that's okay. Those are not good messages for people. We need to remind people that people are people, and that, you make your own bed and you lie in it. And if you want to get ahead, there's mechanisms for doing that, but it requires hard work. And one of the reasons that people who come here as immigrants do so well is because they look around and they say, wow, you mean all I got to do is work hard? All I got to do is go to school and do well? That's all? And I can have whatever I want to do? It's amazing. I was talking to a young woman from Cambodia. Well, she's not so young now, but she was young when she came here, when the Khmer Rouge came in.
Yes.
And completely destroyed their lives. And she ended up in one of the work camps. But at age 19, she was somehow able to get to this country. And now she owns her own business. She became an engineer. And she just talked about all the amazing opportunities that she found in this country that she was not exposed to before. But she also told a cautionary tale about the kinds of things that are occurring in our country now that are very reminiscent of what happened when communism came to their country. And if you go to our website, AmericanCornerstone.org, we have a segment called My American Story. And there are many people like the young woman that I just talked about who came from communist or socialist environments. And they talk about the differences between our country and their country, but how they see some of the very worrisome things starting to happen in our country.
What do you think of the physical health of the country as a physician?
Well, we have about half or more of our population who are overweight.
Yep.
And have some other significant issues, a large increase in type 2 diabetes. And people who generally are not engaged in a lot of physical activity have a lot of musculoskeletal issues. So in general, it leaves a lot to be desired.
What? That's changed pretty quickly. I mean, America did not look like this in the 80s, which wasn't that long ago.
Well, we used to have a lot more physical labor.
Yeah.
And that helped. And, particularly among the men, they had jobs that required a lot of muscle, a lot of work, and you don't have that anymore. And so I think that's affecting people's physical abilities.
Are you worried about chemicals in the air, water, and food?
Well, interestingly enough, I know the green people talk a lot about our fossil fuels and how
Yep.
they're poisoning our atmosphere. But if you're objective, you know that we have the cleanest air and the cleanest water we've ever had since we've done measurements. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to these things, but we shouldn't allow them to be used to manipulate people.
Yeah.
And to control people. That's a real problem. And as time goes on, we learn better and better ways to take care of the environment. I think we've learned to a large extent that we shouldn't be throwing away things that are not biodegradable into our oceans and poisoning our fish. And I think there is a place for regulations that keep us from destroying our environment. But, going to the extreme and using those to control people's behavior, I think is probably not where we want to be.
Does anyone know why testosterone levels have dropped so much?
That's been a big question. Some people think it's because we just don't engage, men don't engage in a lot of physical activity. Some studies have shown that, for instance, the grip strength of men has decreased substantially over the last couple of decades.
I noticed it in the handshakes.
Yeah. And the grip strength of women has not. So they're much closer now than they used to be. So men better be careful out there.
I think that's an understatement. But I mean, the drop has been so dramatic that there's got to be abrupt, that it feels like there's got to be some specific cause that we haven't identified that's important to know about.
I think it's just that we used to be much more physical. And, if you go to countries where, the men and the women still engage in heavy physical labor, carrying around heavy buckets and things like that. I mean, you can go there and you can see like a 70-year-old woman. She can be a lot stronger than you are.
Yeah.
So that's just something that, we have to have enough discipline to not just go and look at the gym, but to use it.
Another topic that YouTube doesn't want you to talk about are vaccines. So probably shouldn't use the word vaccine. I think they'll just take this down if we do. So let me just say I'm in favor of all vaccines and they should all be mandatory. But with that aside, what do you make of the COVID inoculation campaign, with a couple years distance? What was that?
Well, I mean, I think some of the people who were pushing it were sincere, and they really thought that they were saving the population. I think others perhaps had other motives. Some of them linked to profits and monetary issues. What is very troubling to me is the mandates that require people to get the vaccines if they want to keep their job. And so many people in the airline industry, in the medical industry, first line responders, military, lost their jobs, lost their pensions, lost their livelihoods because they refused to do it. Those people have not been made whole, even though it's been proven that they may have been right in refusing to take, the vaccines. And we also discovered that many of the alternative treatments that were basically demonized, like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, were actually very effective. But, we had an FDA rule that said we can't get an EUA, the emergency use authorization for the vaccine, if you had other effective treatments. So they had to, denigrate those. When in fact, the ruling should be just the opposite. It should say, if we're having a pandemic, use every avenue possible to find a solution, not just try to channel everything into one direction. So the other thing that was done is we didn't make known the complication rate of the vaccines. It was much higher than previous vaccines. And, transparency requires that if you're going to treat somebody with something, you need to tell them what the benefits and risks are. We didn't do that. We just said, you got to do this, and that's the declaration. And
well, you're not guessing that. I mean, you're a practicing physician your whole life. I thought that was required, that was like the basis of medical ethics.
Well, it used to be. Something went out of the window in terms of medical ethics here. And they completely threw that out of the window and just said, this is the way it is, and this is what you got to do, and this is what we say. That's not the way we do things in America. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people paid the consequences for it. And you'll remember about 8 months ago, they tried to say, there's a new strain, it's coming back again, we may have to mask up. Nobody was buying it, and it just sort of fizzled out pretty quickly. I don't think we're going to go that route again.
Was it weird for you, since you were a doctor and one of the most famous doctors in the United States, and we were told to trust the doctor, trust the experts, but if you stood up as HUD secretary and said any of these things, you would have been censored on YouTube?
Yeah, no question. And many of the doctors who did try to speak up against it were canceled or denigrated in some way. And people were afraid to speak up. And that was a real problem. I personally was a little bit disappointed with the AMA and some of the medical organizations who just swallowed it all hook, line, and sinker, didn't apply the kind of rigorous thought processes to this that we normally apply to new treatments. And I hope they learned their lesson.
Have they?
I doubt it.
It doesn't seem that anyone has been punished or even admitted fault, or at least I haven't seen it, if that's happened. So that raises the question, well, when we get another pandemic, which we will anyone trust the authorities? Will the authorities have, trustworthiness? I mean, what's going to happen next time?
Well, certainly no one trusts them right now.
Yeah.
And hopefully we'll get a new administration next year, and we can start rebuilding that trust. But that requires transparency and actually explaining things. One of the things that lets you know when you got a problem is when you try to punish people who disagree with you. It's always okay for somebody to disagree, but it's not okay to punish them when they disagree with you. And, we were talking a little bit ago about, election fraud. People who don't engage in election fraud aren't offended by you talking about it. And they don't try to punish you.
Good point. If I can just quote you, one thing about election fraud is people who aren't engaging in election fraud are not offended when you talk about it. I think that's worth getting tattooed on your arm.
Yeah, exactly.
An awful lot of people seem offended by any talk of election fraud.
They're very offended by it. It's sort of like if you stole the cookies from the cookie jar, well, then you're likely to say, no one can talk about the cookie jar. And if you talk about the cookie jar, we're going to punish you. But if you didn't take the cookies, you don't care.
Is there any hope of getting back to a system that people trust?
Well, I think there's hope. Yes, there is hope. I mean, look at France. France banned routine mail-in balloting in 1975 because they said there was just too much cheating. There are too many different ways to cheat, and you couldn't control it. And they went back to paper balloting and an election day instead of an election season. And they now know their results within a day or two. So, we're about the only country in the world that does it this way. And why would we do that? Why has everybody else discovered that it's a problem, but we haven't? Obviously, because somebody's benefiting from the way that we do it. And I think we probably should have a congressional investigation. And let's look at the way it's done in places where it's done effectively and in a way that people trust it. And let's readjust what we're doing.
Why haven't we done that?
Because there are too many people who benefit from the way we do it now. They don't want to change it. They don't want to fix it because then they can't get a glass of water elected.
I think you risk making everyone very cynical about democracy if you have a system like that.
And I think a lot of people are very cynical about it. And this shouldn't be a partisan issue. I mean, this affects all of us. You want to talk about a threat to democracy. Having a voter election system that is very easily fraudulent is a real threat to democracy. And until we if we can send a man to the moon, some people say we didn't really do it, but if we can,
we claim we can,
we can certainly fix this election system. And if other people in the world can do it, certainly we can do it too.
Who did you, I'm sure I haven't even asked you, but I'm sure, you moved to Washington, you spent a lot of your life right nearby in Baltimore, but it's a totally different city from Washington. I'm sure you were appalled in a lot of ways and frustrated. You said the Congress wouldn't even give you your deputies for months. Who are you impressed by? Who did you think was a person of integrity, intelligent, hardworking? Were there anyone in the government you thought was great?
Yeah, there were a number of people that I worked with in the Trump administration. Mike Pompeo, for instance, had many long conversations with him about his work in the CIA. I think...
Did he tell you any secret, like who killed Kennedy?
I can't tell because I didn't have to kill you. No, I'm just kidding.
That's his position.
But I was probably more unhappy with the number of people that I saw who weren't trustworthy. Yeah. They call it the swamp, but Kenny and I call it the cesspool because the swamp at least has some good things in it.
Yeah, it does. It's true.
It's pretty bad, and it's going to require a lot of work to get us back to a point of trustworthiness in the government. And I think that's the reason that the swamp or the cesspool is so frightened of Donald Trump, because he's not a creature that was born there, that was raised there, that accepts and understands their ways. And you can't have a disruptor like that to come into your home and to disrupt it. And that's what they're afraid of. And that's why they will do anything to keep him out of the White House.
Well, including shooting him. What do you make of that? I mean, you obviously you're in the cabinet. You had Secret Service protection. You've been around this a lot. How could that have happened?
Well, it would require the grossest incompetence and negligence that anyone can imagine, or some intentionality. It's hard to explain it any other way.
I agree with that. So it sounds like well, we don't know, I think is the short answer.
I don't know. Yeah.
Nobody does. Well, somebody does, but we don't. But you're open to the possibility that there could have been, as you put it, some intentionality.
Some intentionality. I mean, to have known several minutes beforehand that there was a suspicious individual and to still allow him to go out on that stage. I mean, a third grader would know better than that.
Yes.
So it's very hard to explain.
Trump hasn't talked about it in this way. I mean, in his convention speech, he described what it was like to be shot.
Right.
Things were going on around him at that moment. But he did not suggest that there was, again, as you put it, intentionality. He must know that that's possible.
Right. I'm sure he does. And he knows that they want to get rid of him. You know, I've talked to him about that. And he knows that they're not through trying to get rid of him. Trunk derangement syndrome is a real phenomenon. I know people who've been affected by it. People who used to think logically.
Yes.
And they don't think logically anymore. It's almost like a disease.
Yes.
And, their feeling is that they are right and they are righteous and that they are the protectors of society. And anything that they do is justifiable on that basis. It's very much like the thinking of the radical jihadist. Infidels, you can lie to them, you can kill them, you do whatever you want, and it doesn't count against you because you're righteous.
It's a scary attitude.
It is in a
supposedly secular country.
Yeah, it's a very scary.
So how, considering you're from Detroit, you went to Yale, you spent your life in medicine, you lived around Baltimore. So those are, not one of those is a Trump stronghold.
No, and I grew up very much a Democrat.
Yeah, I'm sure.
From Detroit to New Haven, to Boston, to New Haven, to Ann Arbor, to Baltimore, I was a total Democrat. But I did have some feelings. For instance, when it came to abortion, I never felt that abortion was right. But as a Democrat, I said, I don't have a right to tell you what you should do.
Why did you think it was wrong?
Because it was killing.
It is killing, yes. But why did you recognize that when many people in your position don't?
Yeah, I don't know why they don't recognize it. I can tell you, I've always felt that life is miraculous and precious. I guess that's why, as a young child, I wanted to be a doctor. I listened to the stories about what doctors did. I was particularly impressed by what missionary doctors did. And I decided when I was 8 years old that I would become a doctor. But looking at innocent little babies being killed just because they happen to be in the safest place where you can possibly be, which is in the mother's womb. Therefore, it gives you a right to kill them, some people feel. And I know Kamala Harris feels that way.
Strongly.
And, as a pediatric neurosurgeon, I operated on very premature babies, sometimes 27, 28, 29 weeks gestation. And we had to give those babies anesthesia. They felt everything. And yet you have people who are willing to stick a forceps into the uterus of a 27-week baby, grab whatever is there, twist and pull, and out comes an arm or a shoulder or another part of the anatomy. knowing that that baby can feel that. I mean, to me, it's barbaric. And I don't understand how people can do it. I truly do not understand how medical colleagues can do that.
Well, you must know them.
I do know some of them.
Have you ever talked to them about it?
Absolutely. We've had some very heated discussions.
But, I mean, you're in a different position because you would personally know people who have actually done that, what you just described, which is common. What do they say?
They say they talk about women's rights. But what gives you the right to kill another human being just because that human being is being protected by you? And the thing that really changed my mind is I was thinking about slavery. And I said, what if the abolitionist had said, well, I don't believe in slavery, but I don't have any right to tell you what you need to do? What if that had been their attitude? Where would we be? So, and the Bible says it too. In Book of Proverbs, 24th chapter, 11 and 12 verse. What about those people who are being drawn unto death, innocents? Did you say anything? And doesn't he who sees everything know what you did and what you didn't do? So I think we have a responsibility. When we know something is right or wrong, we have a responsibility to speak up.
I'm amazed that you would talk like this in a hospital, medical school, operating room. I mean, that cannot be a popular view.
And it wasn't. But, you know, I, a long time ago, decided that I'm going to speak out for what I believe in. And even if people try to persecute you, and this comes back to my faith, what is that little persecution against the backdrop of eternity? So I don't really worry about that too much.
I don't think I can improve on that. Dr. Carson, thank you.
It's been wonderful talking to you.
It has been. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So it turns out that YouTube is suppressing our show. I know, shocking that in an election year, with everything at stake, Google would be putting its thumb on the scale and preventing you from hearing anything that the people in charge don't want you to hear. But it turns out it's happening. So what can you do about it? Well, we could whine about it, but that's a waste of time. We're not in charge of Google. Or we could find a way around it, a way that you could actually get information that's true. It's not intentionally deceptive. And the way to do that on YouTube, we think, is to subscribe to our channel. Subscribe, and you'll have a much higher chance of hearing what we say, and we hope you will.